Welcome back to SaharaTV. My name is Rudolph Okonkwo. We are continuing our discussion on the passing of Chinua Achebe yesterday. And now we have someone who actually worked with him. Until last year, our guest was a fellow at Brown University, where he worked at the Department of Africana Studies as a postdoctorate fellow and senior researcher. He worked directly with Achebe. He is also currently the Banting Postdoctorate Fellow at the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University in Canada. Nduka Otiono, welcome to SaharaTV.
Thank you, Rudolph.
Nduka, the passing of Achebe shocked a lot of people across the world. As someone who worked with him directly, how did you receive the news?
I was shocked. I was very shocked because there are some people that you're so up close to and you have shared close working relationship that you do not think in terms of their mortality. More so if the person is a very celebrated, accomplished writer and intellectual of Professor Chinua Achebe's stature. I had become so used to him being around that, thought of him not being around didn't even for one moment pass through my consciousness. And besides, because I had lived in Providence, I lived on the outskirts in Barrington, a small town, and had been used to seeing him almost on a weekly basis. I was so used to Professor Achebe, seeing him often, having to see him walk, and knowing that even if he had reached an advanced stage in life, but that he had this resilience, he had this ability, to just keep going. And this is clearly demonstrated in the publication of his most recent book in October last year. That was A Country. So it was one of shock that somebody I believed was going to be around much longer had passed on. And then it's still very difficult to speak about him in the past.
Now, as somebody that close to him, most people just know him through his works. What do you tell people about him, Achebe the person?
I think that because Professor Achebe has had the privilege of being in the public view as a celebrity for over 50 years, there are not so many people who have that kind of opportunity. Much of his life has been in the public domain, especially his intellectual life and his positions. But working with him is a different kettle of fish because it's giving me opportunity to see that more humane aspect of him, which people gesture to generally. You couldn't come across Professor Achebe and not be struck by his humility, his compassion, his humanism. All of these were evident to me as I worked with him on a weekly basis through meetings that in some cases he's probably the most well informed about the topics that you're talking about, and he would listen sometimes with that kind of childlike innocence that will stun you in the presence of such a great man. And there was so much to learn from him. I witnessed this humility, and I witnessed his capacity to listen and his willingness sometimes to sacrifice personal comfort, in the interest of other people.
Now, before you went to work with him, you probably had a different perspective of who he was. And when you were living, at the end of your time with him, you had a different perspective. Can you share with us the difference?
I wouldn't say so much that there was that kind of, I didn't get a perspective of him that was so different in terms of my relationship with him. I had had the privilege of working with him as far back as, I first met him in 1999, when as a member of the editorial board of This Day newspaper, he was visiting Nigeria after 9 years in exile, and I had to go do a story. That story we later published in the Sunday paper This Day. I was also the arts editor for the Sunday paper, the literary editor, excuse me. And the story was published, and I think the title was Homecoming of a Master Storyteller. That was my first encounter with him. There was something about meeting him that clicked, and I wrote this story. And much of what my initial impressions of him were, as evident in this story, were yet to be concretized. When I later met him. What I would say changed was I got a closer picture of how he works. of somebody who took his time, who was not in a hurry, and who didn't also believe so much in dogmas or cant. He wasn't given to dog tag labels, and didn't really care about those kind of labels which we describe intellectuals, either as being radical or being conservative or being, and all that kind of labels. But somebody who was his own self. And as we worked on the Achebe Colloquium project, I could see that wisdom, came more to the forefront. The way in which he didn't rush into subjects nor rush into conversations, but took his time to digest them. And he would just take his time. And sometimes he would, rather than take an immediate decision on a matter, he would ask, let's step back, let's think about it. And this was very profound for me, especially with my journalism background, where, as Rudolph, you can testify, things have to happen at the moment.
Yep.
I saw the wisdom in many of the decisions that we took in relation to how he could turn around things and think about their various ramifications before we took decisions. And that was what I came away from. And I think I'm the more richer for having had the privilege of working with him that close.
Now, you're a writer yourself, and has he influenced your writing in any way? Yes,
in the sense that with Professor Achebe, I have come to further appreciate the beauty of simplicity. If I might cite some of his famous quotations from Ant Hills of the Savannah, it will enable me to clarify what I mean in terms of the role of the storyteller and the importance of simplicity. He says in Ant Hills of the Savannah, storytellers are a threat. They threaten all champions of control. They frighten usurpers of right to freedom of the human spirit, in state, in church or mosque, in party congress, in university, or wherever. And then he further says, in the same book, writers don't give prescriptions, they give headaches. And if you see a man with this kind of very strong ideological position in terms of the role of the writer in society, and they juxtapose this with the kind of commitment to communication to a broad spectrum of people, which I think is part of what has endured his writing to us. You begin to understand how being close to him and watching, reading some of the memos that he had to write, or the revisions that he has had to make on certain texts, begin to make you appreciate the importance of the need for simplicity, the grandeur in simplicity. This is something I have taken away as a writer, and I hope that, in my subsequent writing, some of the ways that I haven't quite consciously taken note of with regard to working with him and seeing him walk up close might begin to reflect.
Now, let me ask you, as someone who you were close to him, do you think that the young writers of today, your own generation, that Achebe will have said that they are living up to his expectations, especially in line with what you just said about his commitment to writing and how he sees the job, or now we have to talk about him in past tense, how he saw the job of a writer,
Again, being very measured in his tone, and somebody who is not given to being judgmental, it is difficult for me to assess that part of him. I know that in life and in art, he demonstrated a commitment to supporting young people to grow. And so having to evaluate what kind of perception of young people he would have would be like a tall order, not even for a man of that kind of stature and wisdom. But I believe that he has demonstrated his confidence in the work of the younger generation through his support of somebody like me, who didn't have the opportunity of actually being taught by him at Nsukka, as a number of people who had gone on to associate with him are. But somebody that I have met in the course of my career and who had admired my work and invited me to work with him up close. And then when we think of some of the legacies that he has left behind, like the Writers' Center at Bard College, which some of our friends have benefited from, like Helen Habila, and then also his willingness, in spite of his extremely busy schedule, sometimes to offer blog statements for some writers. I will easily cite, say, for example, Chimamanda Adichie. One will begin to understand this generosity of spirit. And I really would like to emphasize Professor Achebe's generosity of spirit. The wife once told me in an interview with her that he was one of the writers that, didn't seclude himself. He didn't go into some kind of seclusion when he was writing. That he was so generous to the extent that he could give up his time, even in the midst of a very serious work. But I think working with him and listening to him, one specific attribute I believe younger writers would have to learn from him is the importance of diligence and patience as writers. Achebe demonstrated this. His last book, which had been in the works for a long time, will be a very clear example of his diligence and patience as a creative writer, and something that we should all take away from us as younger writers.
Now, as we remember him, we're also aware that his generation of writers, people who saw Africa before the Europeans came, and people who saw the transition from a colonial empire to an independent nation and things like that, they are going away. And the new generation are taking over. What do you think about that line of division? Are the new generation still interested in the history or the things that led to Africa being the way it is today?
Yes, I think so. There are a number of writers of our generation who are not only writers but also activists who are writing in blogs, and they're taking the idea of public intellectuals seriously. I would not like to mention names, but I think that Sahara reporters, host some of these writers. One of whom, or two of whom, interestingly, I also have the opportunity of working closely with, and then that's Dr. Pius Adesomi, who is also with me at Carleton University, and whom I work closely with, and Dr. Ken Dibe, whom I share the same kind of relationship with Professor Achebe. Okay, and I, as a matter of fact, share the same office at Africana Studies. And so there are a number of these writers who also have benefited from the example of that first generation. But I want to caution that Professor Achebe himself was not in a hurry to create this kind of generational distinction of younger people and older people. And so, also trying to calibrate in terms of wisdom or in terms of knowledge or in terms of expertise. And this is also in line with his personality of humility, of his self-effacing nature. There are a number of younger writers who believe very strongly that it's not just enough that writers should actually give headaches, and who are practicing this. How this is already beginning to play out in the political structure of Africa, we are yet to determine, because the circumstances that produced Achebe's work, or that first generation, are different. A number of people, including you, for example, have taken on the media as a way of reaching out to the widest public. You might not be, as indeed many of us in the Western diaspora, might not be physically located within the continent, but are contributing in various ways, especially through the social media and the internet, to the struggle to enthrone the rule of law and democracy in Africa. And then also, some of us have the opportunity of working with the older generation as a way of extending their work, and also getting into our own rights as writers and activists. And so the best way to illustrate the point you have raised now is in the current release by the Nobel laureate Professor Wole Soyinka and J.P. Clark, in which they acknowledge what appears to be some kind of change, a successful change of baton taking place. But more importantly, I like to quote a part of this letter which has been released. And I said, we need to stress at this critical time of Nigerian history, where the forces of darkness appear to overshadow the illumination of existence that literature represents. These are forces that arrogantly pride themselves implacable and brutal enemies of what Chinua and his pen represented, not merely for the African continent, but for humanity. Indeed, we cannot help wondering if the recent insensate massacre of Chinua's people in Kano only a few days ago hastened the fatal undermining of that resilient will that has sustained him so many years after his crippling accident. Now, I would like to just end that part of this, up to your question by saying, part of the vanguard of those fighting, these forces also accommodates the younger people across the continent using the social media, using organizing, sometimes even armed struggle as is taking place in, say, the Niger Delta of Nigeria, where some of our colleagues have provided the intellectual framework for some of the armed struggle without necessarily implicating themselves. So I think, yes, there is that kind of change of pattern. But I think also that the approach and the style, has differed because many of us are scattered in diasporas around the world.
Now, let me ask you, if you're asked what is the most important work of Achebe, what would that be? Because most times, especially in the West, people talk about things all apart. Do you think that should be the most important work, or there are other works that should be more important, but people are not aware of it?
I think that as a creative writer myself, it is difficult for writers sometimes to actually identify within a corpus what you say is the most important work, because each work represents a different kind of experience and a different kind of emotional fulfillment, for the writer and the role that that work plays. So I wouldn't be in a hurry to identify one specific work, because I'm also mindful of the fact that Achebe has worked in various genres. He has been an essayist. I could say that Home and Exile is the most important work because it defines some of his theoretical positions, which had gone on to shape the work that he had written, including the essay on Conrad, which is an extremely influential essay, and which, if we continue to look at it critically, may have foreshadowed what we call post-colonial theorizing. And then I also think about his poetry. One of Professor Achebe's unfulfilled ambition, if I might call it ambition, I wouldn't say ambition as it were, but dreams, was to have his poems translated into Igbo language. If this were not so important for him in relation to his theorizing on language, the language of African literature, then that kind of dream would not have been in the pipeline. And so I will not single out. I could also say, that what represents his last work, which is when we talk about That Was a Country, we think is an entirely new book. Yes, it is, a part of it, almost a third of it. But it's also like a retrospective that brings into a single volume some of the most important statements that he has made. And so I think, Rudolph, that it's a rather mischievous question to ask me which is his most important work. I would say all the works are important, but it just turns out that for every writer, sometimes one work becomes a favorite. And my favorite is also Things Fall Apart.
All right. Now, yesterday, the New York Times published a tribute to him. And this morning, they made several corrections. One of which was that they couldn't get the name of where University of Nigeria and Nsukka was located. They said it was in Lagos. They also misspelled the name of Cyprian Ekwensi. And it makes me wonder, if New York Times cannot get correctly information about Achebe or people associated with Achebe, how do they treat writers like you, younger writers who are new in the field? And what does that say about the place of African literature in the world scene, or after 50 years of Things Fall Apart?
This is a very big question that you have asked, and I think it's very difficult for me to provide a short answer because it opens up a very wide vista about what is going on in terms of the production of African literature and the consumption of African literature in our time. A great deal of the writers that are visible internationally now also appear to be writers who have been published in the Western world. What is the implication of the economies of the metropolis, vis-a-vis the continent? All our brothers and sisters, some of whom are extremely gifted, who are publishing in obscure journals, newspapers, and sometimes even blogs. This raises a whole lot of questions about the economy or the production of knowledge. And one way to look at it is to see the significance of some of the Western prizes towards canonizing what we consider as mainstream. So the idea also of mainstream media and alternative media will begin to come to the fore. And so a number of writers that I speak with when I go to Nigeria express almost some kind of apprehension about how many other writers located in the diaspora have written to fit the taste of the Western establishment, either literary establishment or academic establishment. So this is very important. However, when we realize that the title of that last book by Professor Achebe is There Was a Country, you begin to, why would so many years, almost 40 years after Biafra, would the title of a book by a prominent writer, a leading writer, a celebrated writer like Professor Chinua Achebe be There Was a Country? Should that be the kind of question? Why is the title so? I think because the author was thinking about calling attention to the significance of history, towards production of knowledge, and why we as writers from the post-colony, need to continue this conversation with the Western world. And so many of these writers who might not be visible are beginning to resort to the social media as ways, blogs and so on and so forth. And so for those interested in finding the alternative voices to the mainstream voices canonized by New York Times and the rest of them, sometimes not so elegantly as you have exemplified with the corrections that have been made on one of the first generation writers in Africa like Cyprian Ekwensi, then you can see that we have a whole lot of problem that includes extending some of the work that the first generation done in terms of defining ourselves, but more importantly in also asserting ourselves and bringing more and more of the obscure or the marginal voices into mainstream literature and world knowledge, into metropolitan knowledge.
Now, I know you won't want to do this, but I will still ask you because that's one of the things people are discussing online, which is who takes over from Chinua Achebe. When you look at some names that publications like New York Times, when they want to talk about contemporary African writers, they mention some names. And I want to know from you, do you think, that is a perennial question about who decides, who canonizes a writer, who decides who is where in the hierarchy? What do you think? Who takes over? Because people who are watching, they want to hear this. And I know it's not a fair question, but I will still ask you because they're asking that question. Who takes over from Chinua Achebe?
I would say that yeah, I think you have already explained it. It's rather an unfair question to ask. More so because a good number of the people that you might be thinking about be taking over from Chinua Achebe are still producing. Achebe is one of the most privileged writers in the sense that he is one of the living writers who was adopted into every man's library. Not every writer, perhaps the only or the first writer. We can check that to confirm that. And so the historical circumstances that produce Chinua Achebe and the unique role that he has played, is still unfolding if we will transpose that to our generation. Here was a man who rejected, even in the clips that you showed earlier on, the idea of being called a father of African literature. That humility, that self-effacing nature, is in contradistinction with the kind of achievement that he registered in life. And then he was the series editor, the first founding series editor of the African Writers series, published Ngugi and published many of his contemporaries. And at the same time, stood out and have been venerated all over the world. So to begin to say that, I think it's too early. In fact, it's an unfair question in the first instance because we might not be able to say who succeeds Chinua Achebe generally, being that there are people, the kind of dynamics for the production of literature has changed. There are a number of people who are producing. I know some writers back home whom you might not even find any book in any bookstore in the Western world. And I will mention one writer, for example, who has produced over a dozen books in Nigeria, one of the younger generation, and that's Promise Okekwe. I don't know whether, and has won many of the local prizes.
Yeah, I'm aware of, I know about her.
Yeah. So there's some kind of dynamism that is still unfolding that makes it difficult. And to say that, even if it were possible to say that somebody will succeed Chinua Achebe, it would be too early to say that. Because here, as I had mentioned earlier on, writers, if you think about Chinua Achebe, you think about Buchi Emecheta, you think about Wole Soyinka, and then you go further, you think about Ngugi wa Thiong'o and many other African writers, many of whom have been writing for over a generation, for 40 years and above. And then we begin to think about writers, some of whom have only one or two works, that have come out, some of whom may have been acknowledged within the Western literary establishment as holding a lot of promise and to begin to say this person succeeds, Chinua Achebe. So even if that were possible, assuming that we could say that, I would say that it's still a premature question at this point.
Now, one final question. You worked at with the Achebe Colloquium Group, and we don't know whether it will continue. But I want to ask you, what do you think could be done to further preserve his legacy for years to come?
It's a very big question, and one that saddens me. Saddens me in the sense that the Achebe Colloquium had already established a reputation as perhaps the most important meeting of African intellectuals, diplomats, and media workers, journalists, and different kinds of professionals from different parts of the world. And we had gone through the 4th edition. And so I was only a few days ago discussing with another member of the committee about what could be the theme for this year's colloquium. And I was thinking about it and said, okay, I was going to get back to you with a suggestion as to what the theme would be. I think that because of its institutional framework, yes, Professor Achebe has been the spirit behind it. There's so much rethinking that needs to be done, so much re-strategizing, but it's even too early. At this point, we'll be paying a lot of disservice to the memory of Chinua Achebe if we begin to discuss that. I think that all attention will be focused at this time to give him a most befitting send forth to greater glory. And after that, we'll get together to begin to look at that. But I want to quickly add that there are a number of projects that he has inspired, which I will be discussing with some of the people who run the Chinua Achebe Foundation, to find ways in which we shall concretize such amount of work, the Igbo language project, the Meeting of Minds project. There are a number of projects that he has facilitated that we need to sit back to find ways in which you can bring them into volumes and to concretize that. But this wouldn't be done because there are copyright issues and a whole lot of other things that need to be cleared. But right now, I think it's time for mourning, and I will rather just leave every other discussion about that for now.
All right, Nduka Otiono, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that was Nduka Otiono. He is currently a postdoctorate fellow at the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University in Canada. When we come back, we are going to continue our discussion on the Achebe legacy. But in the meantime, we're going to take a break from the coverage to bring you an interview that we had with Nigeria's an architect named Madele Okwumba-Bua. She joined us here in New York with a special interview on African architecture. And remember, we're going to go back to talks about Achebe, and we are going to take your Skype calls, which is when we give you the chance to join our discussion. Stay tuned.